Hey everybody, it is Mrs. Villamez again, and in this section we're going to practice reading two little excerpts from text, and figuring out how the nonlinear plot really affects our understanding of the text as a reader, as an audience. And so in the last section, we kind of reviewed the different nonlinear plot devices, and then we also reviewed linear plot, but now we're going to actually see that in action in a text, which is, I think, a little bit harder than seeing it in maybe a TV show or a movie, or at least harder to identify sometimes. So I'm going to lead you through these first two, and then in the next section, the independent practice section, you guys are going to work on this on your own. So I'm going to read the first two to you, and we'll kind of discuss it together, and then in the independent practice section, you'll do it by yourself. So let's get started. It was May, but the thermostat said it was late August. He rolled up his sleeves and loosened his polyester tie, but there was no relief. 100 degrees, a scratchy uniform, and no air conditioning. It was days like these when John cursed his parents for making him go to Catholic school. He walked into Mr. Yu's class and sighed. They called him Mr. Yu because no one knew how to spell or say his last name. Only one more week, he muttered to himself. He decided to empty his locker of all the old tests, worksheets, and notes. It was then that he came across a class picture from 6th grade. He could barely recognize himself. His braces shone like diamonds in the sky. Suddenly, he was back in the orthodontist's office in great discomfort and seething pain. The bright lamp burned into his eyes as Dr. Skaggs peppered him with questions. So, you play any sports? How about those Yankees? John could not stand how people kept asking him questions as they stuffed more and more cotton and metal into his mouth. He could only make inaudible noises and grunts in response. He felt the pressure as they locked each piece of metal into place. He wondered how people would look at him the next day at school. Would people laugh? Would they care? On the ride home, he felt the braces getting caught on the inside of his mouth. John's thoughts returned to the kids at school. One thing was for sure. Things would never be the same again. The bell rings and he snaps his head up as if waking from a strange dream. He was staring at his messy locker. The picture had fallen to the floor, and he felt people rushing around him to sit down for first period. He picked up the picture and laughed. So what if he had to go through some embarrassment and aggravation? John thought about the braces and how he had blown the whole thing out of proportion. He was about to go to high school, and there were many things he was unsure of or nervous about. Would he fit in? Would he make the football team? Could he keep up with all of the reading and the homework? But as much as these things seemed overwhelming and scary, he knew that he would look back and laugh someday. After all, making mountains out of molehills is human nature. So, any guesses as to what type of nonlinear plot device this might be? So in this story, this is a flashback. Because as you can see, John's kind of looking through his locker, and you can almost picture it in your head, right? He sees this picture of him in 6th grade, and he's kind of transported back into that memory of feeling like he did in 6th grade. So back then he was like worried, oh, these braces are going to be the end of my life. Nothing's ever going to be the same again. Everyone's going to laugh at me. But then now we kind of have some context, like moving forward as he's an 8th grader, he's like, oh my gosh, I blew that whole thing out of proportion. But back then it felt so scary. And what he does is we kind of use that flashback to inform us about the theme of the story in general. So he's nervous about going to high school. And he's kind of freaking out and blowing it out of proportion. Maybe some of you guys will relate as you guys are going to high school. But then by having that flashback there, it kind of serves as the key to help us understand like the theme of this story, which is don't blow things out of proportion. Things pass. Things will get better as they go along. And so in this case, the flashback is really important because it helps us understand maybe our character, John. It helps us understand John as a character, as a protagonist, and then it also helps us understand the theme of the linear plot. So without that flashback, the story wouldn't really mean as much, and it wouldn't have as much heart to it. So that is exactly how something like a nonlinear plot device can really affect what it is that we are reading. So let's try and look at some of the discussion questions, if I didn't just cover some of them. So which nonlinear plot device was being used? So we know that was a flashback because he was taken back to a memory that he had as a character. How does it compare to linear plot? So if we had taken that flashback out, it would have just kind of been him looking at the picture and then putting it down. And then you kind of take out the core of the story, like, and then if John was just like, oh yeah, I remember I had braces once, it kind of takes out the heart of it and really doesn't help us see him as a character, or it doesn't help us see the plot as well as if that flashback were in there. So it doesn't really compare because it does kind of go back in time, but it does help us inform the plot. So how does the nonlinear plot device affect the main plot? So like I've been saying, it hugely affects it. Why do you think the author used this device? Personally, I think the author used this device because it helps us understand really who John is and what his motivations are and kind of what his thought process is. Because without that flashback, we wouldn't really know what he was thinking, and we wouldn't really know why all of a sudden he was just like, oh, well, I don't need to worry about it. So let's look at the next one. If my computer will let me. There we go. I'll move me back down here. So let's see if we can identify the plot device in this one. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large mustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful, as she spent much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbors. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret. And their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister, because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursleyish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they had never even seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. So any guesses as to what kind of nonlinear plot device that was? That's foreshadowing. So remember, foreshadowing is kind of when you get a hint as to what's to come. So one of the very first things that it tells us is that they have a secret. And so anytime you're being told that a character has a secret, doesn't that kind of give you like an inkling as to what's going to happen? Like, obviously that's important to the story, right? Why else would they be telling us that? So it kind of adds some excitement, and it kind of makes you want to stick around to the story a little bit more. It's kind of like, I wonder what that secret is. And if you weren't familiar, that is the opening chapter from Harry Potter. So then later on, when you hear about how they have someone named Harry, if you're familiar with the story at all, you know that they are magical people, that they're wizards. And so you know that people are going to find out about that secret, and that Harry is about to be a part of their life forever after Harry's parents die and they have to adopt him. So let's talk a little bit more. How does this compare to linear plot? So in this case, we're not really jumping forward or anything, but we are kind of like stretching it a little bit. We're stretching that plot, trying to be like, oh, here's what's about to happen, like kind of like getting a peek over the fence, so to speak. We're getting to see what's going to be important later on in the story. It's kind of the author's way of saying like, hey, you need to pay attention to this. This is going to be important later. Really good authors do a good job too of kind of sprinkling in really obvious foreshadowing, and then kind of only foreshadowing that you would really understand and appreciate on your second or third read through of the book. A lot of mystery authors are very good at this, how at the very end of the story, you'll kind of be like, oh my gosh, that was the bad guy. And then you go back and read and you're like, oh, it's so obvious now. There's so much foreshadowing. So foreshadowing is a really cool technique that authors can use. How does the nonlinear plot device affect the main plot? So like I was kind of saying earlier, it affects it pretty greatly, because we know that Harry Potter is a tremendous part of the Dursleys' life. And even though all they want is to be just like normal family, their world is kind of about to be rocked forever, because they're going to have to adopt one of the most un-Dursleyish people that they have ever encountered. And that's going to kind of make them a little cranky, because if you know the story, you know they don't treat Harry very well. And so kind of that this foreshadowing helps us understand them as characters and maybe why they get so upset that they have to raise Harry, who is a wizard, and why they maybe don't tell him that he's a wizard. And then finally, why do you think the author used this device? So kind of the same thing. I think that the author used this device, in this case, J.K. Rowling, used it because she wanted them to understand who the Dursleys were as people and what they valued, and that was about to be put into question, and that kind of like piques our interest as the reader, like, oh, they have a secret, they don't want people to find out about their family. Well, the story's called Harry Potter, so I know something's about to happen. And so as a reader, especially when I was first reading this when I was younger, I was like, oh, I want to know, I want to see these people who are kind of snobby and kind of stuck up, I want to see their world get rocked, and I want to see them kind of have to deal with their secret being out and their struggles with coming to terms with raising Harry. So that was just a quick little guided practice. So these are the questions that I really want you guys to consider as you're reading the next section. So in the independent practice, you're going to read a chapter from the book Holes. Some of you guys might be familiar with that movie, but it's also a book. And Holes is kind of cool because it has both foreshadowing and flashbacks woven together. And so if you're not familiar with that story, I definitely recommend reading the entire book, but at least looking at maybe what some of the main plot points are. Maybe I'll do like a little link to a summary if you're interested in that in the next module. But these are the questions we really need to consider when thinking about nonlinear plot. So what plot device is it? How does it compare? How does it affect the main plot? And then why do you think they use this device? Because authors do everything on purpose. And so that's part of us understanding author's purpose, which we'll get to a little bit later. But so why do you think the author used this nonlinear plot device? So enough of me rambling. I want to see what you guys think. So after you read your excerpt from Holes, you're going to answer some questions, basically questions like this, where you're helping me understand kind of what you think about all of this. So I'll see you guys in the next video.